I'm Emily Chang, and this is the best of Bloomberg Technology, where we bring you all our top interviews from this week in tech. Coming up in the next hour, Amazon holds its annual shareholder meeting, and activists and protesters turned up the heat on the normally low-key affair. We are on the ground in Seattle. Plus, the price of Bitcoin remains well off its December highs, and regulatory concerns have slowed down ICOs. Has the crypto craze run out of steam? And new revelations in the early stages of GDPR's rollout, why Google may now have the upper hand in Europe's digital ad market, and critics are not happy. But first, to our top story. Amazon holds its annual shareholders meeting in Seattle. While the event is generally low-key, interest this year was high. Various activist groups protested outside the meeting Wednesday over taxes, working conditions, diversity, and more. Meantime, inside the meeting, CEO Jeff Bezos said Amazon will take increased government scrutiny in stride and shouldn't take such close examination personally. In fact, Bezos said all large institutions, including corporations, should invite scrutiny, and added that the company has grown from 30,000 employees in 2010 to nearly 600,000 today. We spoke with Bloomberg Tech's Spencer Soper on the ground in Seattle.
Probably the biggest question that came up was on the antitrust issue. A shareholder simply asked, you know, you're getting so big, you're attracting so much attention, you know, what's your take on all of this? And Bezos' response was, you know, it should be expected. And he talked about the company's growth, even going back maybe just to 2010 when they were at 30,000 employees to nearly 600,000 today. And he mentioned that any institution of that size should expect scrutiny. And basically his comment was the only thing that we can do is not take it personally. We have to make sure that when the scrutiny does come, that we pass with flying colors. So that was his basic message to the shareholders on concerned about antitrust issues.
Now, there are protesters of various kinds there. Amazon Air pilots, some people protesting Bezos' amount of control at the company, saying the CEO and chairman roles need to be separated. Walk us through the cast of characters.
Yeah, so there was a group saying Bezos needs a boss was on some of the signs, and they want to see the chairman/CEO role broken in two to give Bezos some, some more oversight and break up that power concentration that he has over the company. The board was against that. So that was one group, and they were outside with signs and things. There were some environmentalists there. They had signs with a big globe that said, big size equals big responsibility, emphasizing that Amazon needs to be a better steward. There was an LGBT group. They're concerned about Amazon's search for HQ2 locations that several of the states that it's identified as finalists have laws that are discriminatory against the LGBT population. So they were here protesting. They actually had a big box truck driving around. There were even some pilots that fly for Prime Air, and they're concerned about contract negotiations. Some union pilots trying to put pressure on Amazon to put pressure on their employers to give them a better contract for their employment.
Spencer Soper for us in Seattle at the Amazon shareholder meeting. Thank you. For more on Amazon's agenda going forward this year, I want to bring in our Bloomberg Global Senior Executive Editor, Brad Stone, who wrote all about Amazon in his book, The Everything Store. Also with us, Bloomberg Intelligence's Jitendra Walwal. Okay, so let's start with the antitrust issue, since that was really top of mind for Jeff Bezos. What do you make, Brad, of what Bezos had to say?
Yeah, it's sort of a measured response, a mature response, consistent with what we've heard from Amazon. Like, we welcome the scrutiny. We need to pass it with, quote, flying colors, he told the shareholders. I mean, look, he has the advantage that what we've been hearing from Washington has been a sort of emotional argument, right, around the post office, postal rates. Look, Amazon, Mary Meeker's report today from Kleiner Perkins, Amazon's got a 28% market share in the U.S., its strongest market. It is by no means a monopoly. You have to sort of redefine antitrust laws to put Amazon in the penalty box, and I think he speaks from a position of confidence.
We're going to mention some of the highlights from Mary Meeker's report a little bit later in the show. I want to talk a little bit about the business, Jitendra, because Amazon continues to maintain small margins, and it used to be a big concern, but recently shareholders haven't been, saying anything about it at all. And I wonder, Are profits and concerns about profits at Amazon a thing of the past?
Sort of. So revenue growth was always the key and will continue to be key because the end market that they're chasing is significantly higher. Now, what's interesting with after Whole Foods era of Amazon is investors actually expected them to take a margin hit as they expand, as they spend, but they did not. They actually surprised on the upside. So what they ended up doing is instead of changing the whole Whole Foods model, they started picking the low-hanging fruit, no pun intended, and basically just taking that and squeezing efficiency out of the system. So they're maintaining margins while maintaining double-digit growth at a very high revenue base, and that's very few companies in the world can do that consistently. So that's the focus.
I recently spoke with Stephanie Landry, who's the head of Amazon Prime Now, also the head of Amazon Fresh, and I asked her about 2-hour delivery in particular and how they could continue offering such a thing at such a low cost. Take a listen to what she had to say.
2-hour delivery is expensive. In order to think about cost, we're really focused on efficiency, and we drive efficiency in a lot of ways. First, knowing where our customers are and what their demand patterns are helps a lot. Next, we really leverage a lot of the algorithms and logistics expertise that Amazon has developed over the last 24 years. We're really great at bringing stuff to customers, and so we think we have a lot of advantages to be able to do well in this space and drive efficiency over time. And then scale, just getting customers to actually use the product. And those are the things that we're focused on in order to drive costs down.
Brad, do you buy the argument that at a certain scale, they can drive the cost down?
Oh yeah, that's the history of Amazon's supply chain, basically. You know, they go and they introduce something like Prime back in 2007. They take a massive loss on it because they're guaranteeing 2-day delivery. You know, at the time it was $79. But then enough people using it that they're filling the backs of those trucks, their own, the post offices, UPS's, and it becomes profitable over time.
I want to ask you about some of these privacy concerns. You know, we've covered the Alexa issue where Alexa recorded a couple's private conversation, then sent it to a contact. There are also concerns now about facial recognition software that Amazon has been basically giving away to law enforcement, which the ACLU has said is also a privacy violation. How serious are some of these issues?
These are not great. You know, the Echo is in this foot race with the Google Home. Google Home outsold Echo in the first quarter of this year. It reminded me of the iPhone saga where Apple admitted that they were degrading the battery performance of new iPhones. Like the conspiracies around the Echo turned out to be true, but I think the strength of the brand is such, and they came out and explained the accident, that they'll survive it. On the AWS front, giving away the recognition software to governments, look, Amazon wants to be in the business with government. They're competing with Microsoft for this $10 billion JEDI contract. I think these privacy concerns are a speed bump for Amazon.
And actually, it's a good thing that it's happening now because voice-based computing is just starting to take off. This is almost an era where we shifted from mouse and keyboard to touchscreens with smartphones, and now it's voice. So that's how big this deal is going to become later on. So more issues coming up now, more they solve it before the industry explodes. So you could actually expect billions of devices in the future being voice activated, voice controlled. So privacy being at the forefront right now is actually a good thing.
That was Bloomberg's Brad Stone and Jitendra Waral. Alibaba is leading the purchase of 10% of Chinese delivery service ZTO Express for $1.38 billion. Alibaba's logistics arm and ZTO will collaborate on everything from delivery and warehouse management to technology. Chinese express delivery has ballooned in the last few years alongside a boom in online shopping as consumers demand faster and more reliable shipping. Still ahead, as the U.S. midterm elections near, cyber threats are at an all-time high. How are countries battling it out in cyberspace? We will ask the CEO of Cloudflare. And if you like Bloomberg News, check us out on the radio. Listen on the Bloomberg Radio app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on SiriusXM. This is Bloomberg. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security has installed a new software sensor in computer networks in dozens of states. The goal is to detect any possible threats or breaches during an upcoming election. But some critics say it's not enough. Meantime, several countries are fighting a new war online, and the number of attacks increasing every year. Bloomberg Quick Take looks at which nations are turning the web into a battlefield and how they are doing it.
Cyber warfare is a cyber attack that has the backing of one nation with the intent of hurting another.
It's using a computer and using hacking to accomplish something that you would ordinarily need a bomb or a gun to do.
This takes on a lot of different forms. It could be infecting an enemy computer by holding it hostage with ransomware, disabling it with a flood of messages, also known as a distributed denial of service attack, or with good old-fashioned malware, like a virus or worm.
Shutting off the power, that's kind of a big one. Shutting off services at a hospital, of course. Transportation networks, so if you shut down rail service, if you shut down port services.
A number of countries, including the US, are known to have active cyber warfare programs. But
Russia decided to really go on the offense and be noisy and make it known that they have these capabilities and that they're ready to use them.
Like causing 2 large-scale power outages in Ukraine, or manipulating social media to sway elections.
The thing that we have to worry more about is not cyber warfare, but these information operations. That's what happened in the 2016 election in the US.
Attacks, including information operations, have grown by the thousands each year since 2006, and those are just the attacks we know about.
I think there's just a lot that happens in wartime that the general public is not aware of. We don't know how often these cyber weapons have been used. We just have no idea.
For more on the top cybersecurity threats in the U.S. and around the globe, we are joined by Matthew Prince, CEO of Cloudflare, which works to improve performance and security for websites and data platforms, as well as Bloomberg tech reporter Jordan Robertson, who you just heard in that piece. He covers cybersecurity for Bloomberg News in Washington. I want to start with election meddling, Matthew, and talk to me about what the risks are, the biggest risks are right now as we approach the midterm elections.
You know, one of the things that we're seeing when we work with state, county, and local governments around the world is that oftentimes the aims of attackers are not necessarily to influence the direction in one direction or another, but just to discredit elections generally. And so we're seeing attacks against things like the sites that people can use to register to vote, where they can figure out what their polling place is, where the official results are published after the fact, and making sure that there's integrity in our entire election process is really critical for a democracy like the United States.
So, for example, the Department of Homeland Security says these things called Albert sensors are now installed in 29 states, and they sort of detect traffic coming in and traffic coming out. Is that enough?
Well, you know, one of the things that's hard in the United States is that elections are inherently local. They're often run by someone who is on their own, a county administrator or a city administrator, and then that percolates up to the federal level. And so these people feel very vulnerable to the widespread attacks that are there. And so I think what the Department of Homeland Security has done is a great first step in understanding and being able to get a landscape on what is going on. But there needs to be additional effort to actually harden and support those administrators that are helping support this critical function of our democracy.
And of course, 29 states is not 50 states. Jordan, I know you've been doing a ton of research on this. You know, give us a little bit more on the state of play when it comes to where states are and what else they are working on to prepare.
Sure. Yeah, as you mentioned, you know, we had some reporting last year that, you know, there were 39 states that were targeted by the Russians in the, known to be targeted by the Russians in the 2016 election. Since then, the Department of Homeland Security has suggested that essentially all the states were likely at least probed or scanned, and there are some fingerprints of these attackers on some of these election systems. Now, some of the national security folks we talk to will say that's a really big deal because these guys are no joke adversaries. These are serious adversaries. So if you've caught a fingerprint of them in one place, chances are there are things that you haven't caught in many more. So states are trying to get up to speed. But as Matthew points out, part of the problem is this, is that, you know, we like to think of hackers like we see in the movies, like they're breaking into these systems, they're tinkering with individual votes to tilt the election in favor of one candidate or the other. And what we've seen so far is that's not really what they're after. What they're really after is to disrupt things, like Matthew said, voter registration or even vote counting. Like one of the big concerns that national security folks have is that the tally, like most counties and most states have upload sites where you know, individuals who are responsible you know, for the tallies at individual stations will go and upload results to the county level. You know, those are all data links that can be disrupted by hackers, and that's really what a lot of the folks in the national security community worry about, is that those links are disrupted and just the counting gets disrupted.
Matthew, Is Russia the only country we need to worry about when it comes to U.S. election security and election security around the world, or are there other countries trying to get in on this game?
I think that if you think about who the adversaries of the United States are and who would benefit from undermining the confidence in U.S. democracy, all of those countries are trying to think about how they can potentially influence elections. And so we spend less time thinking about who the particular countries are and spending more time thinking about how can we support those individual state, county, city officials that are administering these elections. So we run something called the Athenian Project, where we give away Cloudflare's core service to state, county, and local governments in order to make sure that regardless of it's the Russians or the Chinese or some kid in the basement in Iowa, if they're trying to disrupt your election, we want to say we've got your back and we can help protect you and help you stand up for whatever it is that comes apart. What's pernicious about this is, again, it doesn't matter, as Jordan said, whether the attack success pushes the election one direction or another. If we're worried about these attacks at all, it undermines our faith in democracy, and that's a lot of what the attackers are just trying to do.
You know, these potential election attacks are very top of mind right now, but as Jordan talked about in his piece, we're also concerned about attacks on the power grid, and these could have, much more sort of far-reaching implications. What should we be worried about right now beyond the midterms?
Well, I think that, the internet was never designed to do all of the things that it does. And we have come to rely on it as this critical piece of infrastructure, but it doesn't have the performance, security, reliability traits that we would have designed the network to have from the beginning. And so at Cloudflare, we're really proud of being at one of the organizations that's thinking about how we can build a stronger internet, and whether that's protecting elections through something like the Athenian Project, or that's working with power companies to make sure that their infrastructure is hardened, or individual small businesses that might be targeted by hackers. What we need to have is a faith in the underlying foundation of the internet, regardless of what the services are being provided on top of it.
Now, Jordan, something you've raised recently is not just attacks on software, but attacks on hardware, which can be even more difficult to detect, more difficult to prevent. What is the scale of the threat here?
Well, Emily, part of the problem with attacks on computer hardware, as we've seen this year with vulnerabilities such as Spectre and Meltdown, which attack computers' microprocessors, is they leave virtually no trace. So a lot of what we've talked about in the last 20 years regarding hacking has been software-based attacks. So once you discover them, once you fingerprint them, you can remove them from your computer in most cases. The problem with hardware attacks is twofold. One, they tend to leave no trace. There's no record of the attack happening. And two, if you discover that a piece of malware is embedded in your hardware, you can't remove it. You literally cannot remove it. You have to throw away the hardware. So this is where spy agencies have dwelled for a very long time. This has been open season for years and years and years for the US and the Chinese and the Russians and all the really advanced attackers that want to get deeply embedded inside an organization's computer systems. So, the cybersecurity industry is really starting now to take a hard look at, how do we secure these computer systems that are not part of government networks or banking networks or these networks that are already very heavily protected. How do we secure hardware for the average person that's walking around with a supercomputer in their pocket, in a phone form? So these are threats that, again, the national security community, banking sector, the really highly defended sectors have looked at for quite some time. But when it comes to the consumer space, the idea of a hardware attack is one that the security industry is really just now starting to grapple with, and there isn't an easy fix.
Thanks to Matthew Prince, CEO of Cloudflare, and Bloomberg's Jordan Robertson. Coming up, we have had a few days to process GDPR's impact, and it turns out the ad industry's fears about Google domination may be true. How the tech giant captured the largest share of Europe's digital ad market. Next, this is Bloomberg. Tesla's Model 3 sedan has now scored a coveted recommendation from Consumer Reports. The magazine initially declined to recommend Tesla's more mainstream model after testing showed it took longer to stop than a Ford F-150 pickup. Since then, CEO Elon Musk has ordered an over-the-air software update that improved braking by almost 20 feet. This was enough to raise the Model 3's overall score for the car to be recommended by the magazine, but testers still have concerns about wind noise, a stiff ride, and an uncomfortable rear seat. For months before European data privacy laws came into effect, Google's rivals fretted that the search giant was poised to benefit at their expense. And after a few days of operating under the new rules, those concerns may be warranted. Google captured an even bigger share of marketing spend flowing through Europe's digital ad market on May 25th, GDPR's first day of implementation, than it normally does. This according to a leading ad tech company. We spoke with Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde from London and Bloomberg Tech's Mark Bergen, who covers all things Alphabet and more.
So we saw a couple things happen on Friday when GDPR went into effect. A lot of European marketers and publishers just stopped spending on automated advertising, right? They were a little nervous that these new rules where every single company, there's just dozens of companies along this sort of supply chain that serve you a digital ad online, they're now required to get consent. So a lot of them pulled back. A lot of them said, okay, we know that Google is in compliance and Google has enough money and lawyers, so we're just going to spend and we feel more comfortable spending with Google. There are also some companies that claim that Google was sort of shifting more dollars in that direction. It sounds like that's moved back towards an equilibrium, but I think it just demonstrates here the concern that these companies have that Google is just very powerful in this market.
Right, you have a quote from one of them saying, anyone who says GDPR is a good thing is either a monopoly or a liar.
I think that quote was anyone who's prepared, right? In the sense that there was this concern that there would be mayhem that struck on May 25th. And a lot of companies didn't know exactly what the future would hold.
Now, Caroline, what are you seeing on your side? Because some U.S. publications are reportedly avoiding running ads at all right now, and some of them, as I understand it, are still unavailable in Europe.
Yeah, in some ways it's incredibly frustrating. Say I was a loyal reader of the LA Times or the Chicago Tribune, I still cannot access those websites because they've just decided to step back from the huge market of the EU because they're worried they're not compliant with GDPR. But also, rather relievingly, I mean, it's a rather nice experience when I perhaps go into the Washington Post or the New York Times because they're not targeting ads at me at all. Instead, they're only running adverts for their own offerings. So Washington Post only advertises other parts of the Washington Post or potentially some of their videos. Similar for the New York Times. And USA Today hasn't got a single advert up there whatsoever. So in a way, as a user, it's either I get nothing or indeed a rather more pleasant experience when going onto these particular websites. It really is showing who is ahead of the game and who is really rather nervous.
So you've got a quote, Mark, from publishing groups saying Google is effectively putting a gun against publishers' heads. This is a flagrant abuse of their dominant position. Is this an opinion that you think is going to be mitigated in the coming days?
Yeah, I mean, you see that exact point where some publishers have opted, okay, we're not going to serve any personalized ads. And that's been the concern from a lot of these publishing groups, is that Google did not give them adequate time and is not to prepare in advance. I think it just, again, speaks to the fact that Google and Facebook dominate the advertising market. There's some dispute about how Google is sort of identifying itself as the controller of the data. These publishing groups say Google is saying we need access to the data in order to do things like detect ad fraud or just to improve our ad products. The publishers are just saying this is a land grab. I think that Google has been working behind the scenes, as with Facebook, especially in the EU, around the antitrust issues to mend their relationship with publishers. I think that's gone a pretty far way. I think Axel Springer, which is a large German publisher, has been the most vocal in the past, and we haven't seen them kind of come out and say something like Google is crooks. This is not coming directly from the publisher. This is coming from trade organizations whose job is to punch up.
Thanks to Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde in London and Bloomberg Tech's Mark Bergen. Coming up, Amazon held its shareholder meeting on Wednesday amid new questions being raised about the power held by its board. We will discuss next. And a reminder, all episodes of Bloomberg Technology are live streaming on Twitter. You can check us out at Technology weekdays, 5 p.m. in New York, 2 p.m. in San Francisco. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to the best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang. As we've been discussing, Amazon held its annual shareholders meeting in Seattle on Wednesday. Shareholders rejected a proposal that would have required Amazon to separate Bezos' chairman and CEO roles, though the event raised new concerns about the power of both Bezos and the board. Directors recently adopted a policy under some duress requiring that women and minorities be considered for board seats. We spoke with Shannon Gordon, CEO of the Board List, a group that works to connect women to serve on public and private boards.
I applaud any company that takes steps in the right direction on this topic. Moving towards having a more diverse board is certainly going to be positive for the company. And I think it sends a great signal out to other companies. So the hope is that others follow. But let's be honest, I mean, there's still a long way to go. This is kind of step one.
Amazon has, 3 out of its 10 directors are women. Right. They are all white, though actually it's above average when it comes to gender representation on companies of a similar industry, similar size. So is it fair to be picking on Amazon?
Well, I mean, I think there's always more work to do, right? Yes, certainly above some of the statistics. So Fortune 1000 companies, 20% of board seats held by women. Private companies, far worse at 7%. There's a lot of work to do. It's great that Amazon is already at 30%, but not at parity. So there's always going to be more.
Now, one of the issues that's been highlighted here, the Wall Street Journal just had a big story about founder control and the amount of founder control that tech company CEOs have, especially they get special stock dispensations, they have special voting rights, they have a disproportionate amount of influence over the company. We've seen how that can work in the wrong direction at a company like Uber. Is that part of the problem when it comes to the lack of board diversity?
Absolutely. I mean, diversity, I think we can think about that in a lot of different ways. Ethnic, cultural, dispersion of power, right? I mean, I think at the core of it, it is about having a diverse set of voices around the table. And when you consolidate power in one seat, i.e. the CEO with these super voting rights, I think that gets dangerous, right? As you pointed out, we've seen the results of that at companies like Uber. So I think it is very important that power remains distributed so that the board can play its role in corporate governance and really have that oversight power.
A Silicon Valley Bank study found that while more startups are focused on diversity and inclusion programs, they say, actually when you do the math, the majority of them still have all male boards and don't have any female executives. More than half of them don't have any female executives. How powerful is a diverse board in terms of that trickle-down effect and encouraging diversity elsewhere across the company?
Right. It's absolutely critical, right? I mean, I think when these things come from the top, first of all, if you have a different set of, a different point of view expressed at the table, you're very, very likely to be able to better meet company challenges, so you're very likely to have better financial outcomes, and the data shows that. So that, from a financial and company performance standpoint is absolutely critical. I also think it's critical on the culture front, right? So as we see some of these changes happening at the top, it's easier and easier to embed these diversity in the conversation at all levels of the employee base.
So, for example, we recently wrote a story about how Amazon HQ2 has this great opportunity starting from scratch. They're creating 50,000 new jobs to say, hey, why shouldn't those jobs be half and half, men and women, to represent people of color in line with the local population? Do you think that's something that's realistic?
Absolutely. I mean, as you pointed out in that article, when Amazon puts its mind to something, it can make it happen. I mean, I don't think there's any reason why this isn't possible. There is, a phenomenal pipeline of talented women at all levels, board certainly, and all the way up through the pipeline. And so there's no reason why Amazon can't tap into that talent to bring more diversity to the table.
I want to talk about that because so many people say to me, oh, we interviewed this amazing woman, executive at such and such company, but she's so in demand, she chose another board to join. Yep. And so, what is the actual supply like? Because so often I hear we can't find the women.
The supply is strong, right? This is not a supply issue, it's a demand issue. So
why isn't the demand finding the supply? And I know that's what the board list was founded to do, is sort of improve that disconnect.
Yeah, well, there's a couple things, I think. The first is this topic of independent board members. So at private companies in particular, when only investors are on the board of a company, which tends to be a male-dominated industry, I think it's harder to bring in some of the gender diversity, right? So seeking out operator point of view via an independent board member is a great way to go get some diverse points of view. I think the other issue is homogeneous networks, right? So when people are doing a board search very traditionally, they're reaching out to their own network. One of the things that the board list does is surface some of that emerging talent or talent that homogeneous network might not typically have access to.
Is the board list focused on tech companies only?
No.
Or companies across the board?
No, actually we started with tech, but there are great women across all verticals, and the board list now represents that community.
So where are you seeing progress, and where do you still see challenges? Are there any industries in particular that seem to be doing better than Silicon Valley?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see progress in announcements like the change that Amazon's made. I mean, albeit a little bit difficult to get to, right? But as we start seeing these things move, I think it's a really positive sign. But like I said, there is a ton more work to do, and we need to remain focused on it.
It's not just about adding women; it's about adding people of color,
right.
adding different kinds of diversity, which might be a little bit more difficult to quantify. Is the Rooney Rule, is that something that you would like to see every board do? I mean, what are some sort of strategies for companies that are finding themselves in this so-called predicament to find these, find hidden talent, essentially?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, I think the board list is a great place to start because it's a tool, it's a platform that provides visibility beyond your first order network. We know that great people know great people. Our platform is built on an endorsement model, so you can be sure that the people that are on that platform are board ready. So no concerns about qualification there. That's certainly one thing that companies can do. I think also it's about, as I said before, just embedding diversity into the conversation. There's so many companies that are taking steps to embed this in their recruiting process, right? From the language that's used in job descriptions to the process that they use to get referrals from the employee base. I think there's a lot of changes that can be made at a very fundamental level. It'll make a big difference.
Thanks to Shannon Gordon, CEO of the Board List. Well, it is another sign of trade tensions between the United States and China. The Trump administration will set limits on China visa applications starting next month. In some cases, the new measures would reduce the amount of time that a Chinese citizen could stay in the United States. The White House says it's to protect American intellectual property from being stolen. Coming up, Bitcoin hits below its 12-month trailing average. We'll talk to the CEO of CoinList about some of the regulatory hurdles cryptos are coming up against. That is next. This is Bloomberg. Facebook is facing an expanded class action lawsuit for discriminating against older job seekers. The Communications Workers of America alleges Facebook's algorithms direct more ads to younger workers, filtering out older candidates. Companies like Amazon, Cox Media, and T-Mobile were among those who used these filtering tools. The union also alleges that even Facebook used the age filtering to find its own employees. Bitcoin enjoyed a boom, but are we now looking at the beginning of a bust? The cryptocurrency hit below its 12-month trailing average for the first time since October 2015. But it's not just Bitcoin. If you hop into my Bloomberg, you can check out this chart on GTV. We've seen the rise and fall of a number of cryptocurrencies, including Ethereum, Ripple, and Litecoin. A lot of the volatility is due to regulatory uncertainty. However, initial coin offerings have raised more money in 2018 than last year, and we're not even halfway through this year. To discuss, we caught up with CoinList CEO Andy Bromberg. CoinList is where digital asset companies manage their token sales and investors discover high-quality projects. Prior to CoinList, Andy was CEO of Sidewire and co-founded the Stanford Bitcoin Group. Our Bloomberg executive editor and host of Wedge and Myth, Joe Weisenthal, also joined us.
We're really seeing two things happen here. The first is a bifurcation between the high-quality projects and the low-quality ones. I think last year, investors weren't yet sophisticated. They were figuring out the markets. Anyone could raise. Now we're seeing the high-quality ones be able to raise large amounts of money, the lower-quality ones not as much. But the second is this just increasing interest from investors all across the world. It's amazing whether you're at the Eiffel Tower or the Pyramids of Giza or the Golden Gate Bridge, you are seeing investors talking about ICOs all the time. And that increasing interest, increasing sophistication from investors is going to drive this industry forward moving in the next couple months.
So, Joe, I'll put a similar question to you. Is this the start of the boom or beginning of a bust?
I don't know the answer. I wish I did know the answer to that. But I do find it to be pretty striking the way in which we see this relentless decline. Obviously, you mentioned Bitcoin, but pretty much all of them, all at the same time. despite the fact that we get a pretty steady drip of news coming out about infrastructure being built out, institutional interest being developed, partnerships between startups in the area and legacy companies doing trading. You know, so much of the hype in the second half of 2017 was about this wall of institutional money that was supposed to come into the space. And we see a lot of the building blocks for that continuing to happen. But, you know, it's just obvious that hasn't translated into price increases the way I think a lot of people would have guessed.
And at the same time, the DOJ has opened a criminal probe into whether traders are manipulating the price of Bitcoin and other digital currencies. Joe, how serious is this?
I think it's serious. We don't really know the details. We don't really know what specific things they're going to be going after. But there are obviously a lot of pretty shady activities in the space. There's pump and dump rooms where people get together and try to manipulate a coin. There's credible allegations of false trading designed to spoof people into thinking the price is doing one thing and it's not the other. But I also think that as part of this theoretical institutionalization of this space, you probably get a lot of players who are happy to see bad actors rooted out.
Andy, how much of a concern are these shady activities in the business that you're in and the concern about impending regulation?
They're a real concern, certainly the shady activities at least. You know, we look at this as a market that's developing incredibly quickly. Traditional equities markets developed over the course of decades or even centuries, and we're seeing the exact same things happen in the crypto markets in the space of months or years. And so instead of, you know, having time to figure out all of these different components of the market, it's happening so quickly. There are a lot of bad actors, and these need to be rooted out. We're happy with the DOJ investigation. We think there is market manipulation happening, and that needs to be stopped. At the same time, I think that regulation often is a good thing. And figuring out how existing regulations apply to the crypto space is really important. We've seen very forward-looking statements from the SEC and from the CFTC and other agencies so far. We expect to see that continue, but we see that as a good thing for the space as the entire space gets professionalized. To Joe's point, the institutionalization is happening, and that requires regulation to come in.
Now, you're working on building out a platform where accredited investors can invest in ICOs, but isn't that the very thing that ICOs were created to destroy?
Well, we think ICOs were created to fund technical projects and fund protocols that wouldn't otherwise be able to raise the funding that they need. We work with accredited investors because we want to work under U.S. securities law and offer those securities or things that may be securities to American investors. We also partner with companies like Republic, which is an equity crowdfunding platform allowing non-accredited investors to invest in securities for some of our sales. But at its core, we think that the access that's being granted by the token industry by ICOs isn't necessarily that it has to be granted to everyone in the world, but just that it opens up fundraising. Traditionally, venture capital fundraising is done only by relationships, and very few people get access to deals. In this world, even if it's just an expansion to all accredited investors, that's still a huge innovation over existing fundraising methods.
Joe, the amount raised in ICOs is down over the last couple of months from a March sort of spike. What's your read on that?
Well, the levels are still extraordinary. And again, this sort of speaks to what I was talking about before, the sort of two different crosswinds, because yes, you see prices declining and signs of the air being let out of a bubble, if you want to call it, but still the interest is absolutely enormous. And to Andy's point about hearing people talk about ICOs all over the world, it's still pretty remarkable how even with the price declines, it just doesn't feel like there's been any let up whatsoever in the the talk interest in this space. And Emily, I'm sure your inbox and your email address is flooded with blockchain and ICO pitches from PR people. Mine hasn't slowed down at all, even with the price declines.
Absolutely. Add the word blockchain and people think they're going to get some sort of enthusiastic response, but it's actually the opposite right now. You know, Andy, who are your investors? Is it mostly high net worth individuals, family offices? Is it hedge funds?
Yeah, when we talk about the investors in the CoinList platform that are investing in these token sales, it is a huge swath of people, and it's actually really challenging to characterize. We have everyone from small retail investors that write $100 or $1,000 worth of money into these sales, all the way up to endowments, family offices, venture capital funds, cryptocurrency hedge funds. Of course, you see the majority of the money come from those larger institutions because their check sizes are so much bigger, but we see way more activity on a number of investors basis from the smaller retail investors that are just really excited to invest in these token sales and get access to deals they might not otherwise have.
That was CoinList CEO Andy Bromberg and Bloomberg's Joe Weisenthal. Coming up, one hedge fund manager has a novel way to turn a profit from investing in Tencent, whether shares go up or down. Details on that next. Plus, why Goldman Sachs is betting big on blockchain, getting into late funding rounds, exploiting the blockchain to tackle what they say is a $9 trillion business opportunity. We will hear from the CEO next. This is Bloomberg. Facebook is planning to offer its WhatsApp payment services to all of India starting next week, even without a partner. Fourth partner, State Bank of India, will join once it has its systems in place, this according to people familiar with the matter. The rollout shows just how urgent the race is to win market share from local rivals, Google and Alibaba-backed Paytm. WhatsApp has more than 200 million users in India. And while Tencent remains one of the biggest tech firms in the world, the stock has seen dramatic swings over the last year. One hedge fund manager says he has a novel idea to invest in Tencent without taking on so much risk. BFAM Partners founder and CEO Benjamin Fuchs detailed his strategy to Bloomberg's Stephen Engel from the Sedan conference in Hong Kong. Take a listen.
The stock's been bullish for so many years that people aren't assigning a very high probability to a sell-off. And just to be clear, we aren't necessarily calling for a big sell-off in the stock, but if one were to occur, these puts will have a significant amount of value.
So what is the distribution of your call? I mean, because you are also saying go long with some shares.
That's right. So we would do this on what we call a theoretical delta. It means when you buy the put, we're recommending to buy the March 2019 25% out of the money puts, which have what we call a 10 delta. And that means you buy about 10% of the stock when you buy the put. And the effect of that, Steve, is that were the stock to rally a lot, you're actually going to obviously lose the money on your premium, but you're going to make quite a bit of money on the stock that you're long. So this bet really allows you to make money in extreme moves either way. If it's down a lot or down or up a lot, you'll actually make quite a lot on this trade.
Would you consider your call here a bit of a contrarian view, because a lot of the put option premiums are so low? Because look at the consensus ratings on this stock. More than $500 is the consensus rating. We have one Morningstar calling for $641 over the next 12 months. It's a $399 stock right now.
That's right.
So the bets, even from the big institutional banks, continued rise.
That's exactly my point. The dominant view is that the stock can only go up. So if it were to go down, it's really going to catch people by surprise. And I think one of the things that I talk about in the presentation is just from a market cap point of view, the company already has a $500 billion market cap. It's an amazing company, no question about it. But the market knows that, investors know that, analysts know that. So were the stock to hit some of those targets that people have, up 30%, it would be bigger than Google, world's fifth largest stock. Up 85%, it'll be bigger than Apple, almost world's first $1 trillion stock. Can that happen? For sure, but it's just not that probable in the next 6 to 12 months, in my view.
That was BFAM Partners founder and CEO Benjamin Fuchs with our own Stephen Engel. Well, supply chain payments company Tradeshift has announced it is raising $250 million in Series E funding, led by Goldman Sachs and PSP Investments. The new round of financing brings Tradeshift's total funding to more than $400 million and values the company at $1.1 billion. This after the company launched a new service enabling blockchain-based finance, a cloud platform for the supply chain. They describe it as Salesforce for the supply chain, and that's now offering blockchain-based payment solutions. We spoke with Tradeshift CEO Christian Lang.
If you think about supply chains, they're very complicated. They have many different partners working on a single product, typically multiple tiers down. So what we do at Tradeshift is we provide our customers with an end-to-end cloud platform to run everything that happens in your supply chain. Now, for a lot of scenarios, they actually need to collaborate with third parties or multi-stakeholder ecosystems where blockchain is a really good fit. So for all of those scenarios, we allow them to write the transactions to blockchain. They can collaborate, they can share data. For instance, if you have a certificate proving this this has been produced in a sustainable way or free of carbon or whatever you want to do, you can then stamp those things to the blockchain, and all of the other partners around that piece of the ecosystem, they can see that data and they can have access to it without needing to opening all of your data, all of your books. So it allows people to collaborate much more efficiently.
Now, I've read that the accounts receivable market is like a $9 trillion market. How much of that could you potentially address? So
actually B2B is massive. For every single consumer transaction, there's around 9 B2B transactions. We move more than $500 billion in trade already. It's roughly the same as Amazon. So out of that $9 trillion market, just here in the US, it's $1.2 trillion that's right now outstanding in payments between companies. So if we can make that more efficient, if we can move capital faster, and if we can help people trade more efficiently, that's a massive opportunity.
Now, Goldman Sachs, now one of your investors. I was speaking with David Solomon a few months ago, president of Goldman Sachs, about blockchain and Bitcoin in particular. Take a listen to what he had to say.
We think blockchain, very, very interesting technology, but whether or not cryptocurrencies become a real store of value and how that all evolves, that's something we're going to watch very carefully.
Now, what I find interesting is that you don't actually accept cryptocurrency as a payment form. Isn't that kind of an oxymoron?
No, I actually think the potential for blockchain is in many other areas, especially as you look in business, than necessarily the crypto payments. Cryptocurrencies are not very stable means of payments. If you have a business, you want very stable currencies. This is a problem. I think the ability to coordinate large, complex ecosystems of people and companies is much more relevant. I think having transparency for financing, being able to write payables, for instance, so you can share them with your bank or your creditor, is much more important than necessarily moving currencies first when it comes to companies. I think we need to see a next generation of currencies that are far more stable before that's really relevant for the B2B side of the world.
Now, that's interesting because I also sat down with the CEO of Stripe recently, and the company had just stopped accepting Bitcoin as a form of payment. Take a listen to what